The second day of the conference began with a session in addressing inequalities in Africa. Thandika Nkadari, chairman in African Development at the London School of Economics, stated that the discussion on inequalities talks about reforming capitalist economies.
In economics, there are two types of inequality. One is called functional income distribution, which is where you look at earnings by owners of factors of production. Wages for labor, rent for landowners, profit for the capitalists, interest rate for the financiers and all this. So you could use historical income categories, and that was the way income distribution was discussed, at least in economics, until the 1970s. From the days of Ricardo on, they all talked about functional income distribution. The second type of income distribution is personal income distribution, where you look at how income distribution is distributed across households in different sort of categories of households, and you create, usually you get the Gini coefficient, which you must have heard about yesterday quite a lot. And much of the debate today about income distribution is about personal income distribution. The distinctions are not minor. They are fundamental implications of which of these two you use. And I think in a profound, you could say, of course they are related. Personal income distribution is an outcome of how people access incomes, and they access incomes through wages, through profits, through rents, through. Okay. And my own view is that actually, if you're going to make the link between income distribution and structural transformation, which we've been talking about, then you'll be forced to take on functional income distribution. Okay. The reason why we've been having problems, I listened yesterday very carefully. I couldn't hear anybody make the link between income distribution and the talk about structural transformation. Because the link really is through the production structure and through the allocation of income to people who are the different producers.
Representatives from the various African continents shared their experiences on inequalities.
Really the starting point is exactly equality of what? Equality for what? And I come from Tanzania, and I want to share with you one perspective that is a reason out of the resource nationalism that is emerging now in Tanzania, very much informed by the inequality that is seen to emerge out of the foreign investment that is coming into the extractive industry, into the mining and oil and gas. And there is that ethos, that passion in Tanzania amongst labor, amongst the business players, the business associations, as well as some members of the civil society, saying, what isn't it for us? You know, is there a greater equality to foreigners vis-a-vis us in terms of how we own our resources and benefit from our natural resources? So this is one major dimension that has happened.
Hopefully this what we call a framing presentation will allow us to actually begin to engage with what is real about our context. I had some economists talking yesterday about structural transformation, in which I don't understand where that came from in terms of what do you call it, institutional economics or development studies. Much more than any other time, especially in 1976-75, that led to the Lagos Plan of Action. On the African continent, and I'm not talking about South Africa now, okay, the rest, we consume what we don't produce, and we produce what we don't consume. For all the glorious stories told about Ghana, Ghana is far worse off structurally today than it was in 1960. The oil revenue inflow is going to damage the thing more. Okay? So when we talk about structural transformation, what exactly do we mean? And it's important for us to pay attention to a little things around us. The buses that we're using to go from here to the hotel and back is made by Yutong. Huh? These are Chinese companies. All right? We've moved from importing from, Europe or North America to importing from China. But never ask ourselves, what is it that the Chinese did? Everything we are told not to do, the Chinese did. Fundamental to this, you cannot talk about structural transformation without industrial policy.
In reaction to some of the questions posed during the session, Her Excellency Sarah Darabakaba, Secretary General of Mano River Union, said, "Inequalities are embedded in our minds."
And women and men, but also rural against urban. Our development is centered on urban cities, not on rural areas. We are really discriminating disabled people, and that is true. Women, that is true, but more and more young people. They are not given space, really, to learn how to lead our countries. We have really not created a system, a process where we are empowering our young people so that they can take over in the leadership. The level of the political leadership has gone down. 50 years ago, I remember the founding members, the founding fathers of our country. They were far more visionary than we do. Now we are more centered on our persons, our own achievement, than the national issues, than the national development, and of course, the sub-regional and regional integration. And that I can tell you, I'm leading now a sub-regional integration organization. You can see that the young generation doesn't know about common challenges. Education, health, food security are not more national issues.
There was also a parallel session on structural inequalities in Africa.
That's the truth of the matter. America is carrying several problems. When China is being asked to do that through the ICP, he is refusing, running away. You have to accept responsibility.
What is happening in Cameroon is that the government is emphasizing on mechanization, agricultural mechanization and transformation, second generation agriculture. And if we are talking about mechanization of agriculture, I think that it is difficult for us here to be talking about labor intensive, because we know that if we use machines, then we mean that the number of people we need will reduce. So I don't know how we are going to harmonize the fact that we need labor intensive options for agricultural sector production, and at the same time we want to mechanize so as to increase production. I know that also there is emphasis on transformation of the locally produced or local products, agricultural products, and so primary materials. A lot of emphasis is going on. In fact, before I came here, tractors are already being distributed to some major farming groups, tractors in Cameroon. So I think I would like to react there by finding out how we are going to reconcile the two.
I think we're sitting here discussing inequality and hoping that we are in a position to revisit our macroeconomic framework for Africa. Well, we've said it and we are going to repeat it, that Africa is not one. It is not a homogeneous monolithic block. There are different countries, different kinds of leaders, different mindsets. But to me, what seems most important, if we are really serious about addressing inequality, is the need and the urgent need to actually make this articulation between the economics and social become part of the macroeconomic framework without forgetting the gender lenses. Because I think macroeconomics has to be done with a gender infusion and gender lenses infused within the macroeconomic thinking. But let's be honest, let's call a spade a spade. How many of our finance ministries, which are actually responsible for macroeconomic framework, are really in a position to first understand, second, to actually implement a gender-sensitive approach to the macroeconomic framework?
One of the main speakers on measuring progress, Pali Lehola, a statistician general of South Africa, made it known to the participants that statistics and data are the main tools that can be used to find inequality-associated problems and solutions.
And part of going beyond averages is to look at data sources and how you create knowledge. And it's about drilling into the data. African governments don't look at the data, and they want to, we want things that are easy and cheap, is it not? We don't look at the data. We like to talk about evidence, but we don't want to use the evidence.
According to Leburan Motslana, the director at the United Nations Development Project Regional Service Center in Addis Ababa, data is subjected to political interpretation for political and social aims. He suggested that there was the need for cooperation to fight inequality.
Most African countries are still planning without facts. Some countries' planning and policy decisions-making processes are still not evidence-based. About 50 years after Wolfgang Stolper celebrated publication in 1966, Planning Without Fact, this challenge is yet to be fully addressed in all African countries. Most of the discussions on inequality at the national level, for instance, are based on old statistics, some older than the decade. This is not acceptable in the 21st century. The investment by African countries has to be seen on par with other critical investments made by governments to development programs. Most analyses on poverty and inequality in Africa have been driven by income inequality. While this is an important measure, yet it remains inadequate to address inequality in Africa. The focus is on meeting the threshold of having poverty and inequality. Africa needs to emphasize lifting people completely out of poverty.
Adrana Kokoni, a fellow at Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, in her presentation said, MPIs can inform policies.
And it's also providing good incentives in the sense that we are not just trying to get people out of poverty, just making them go a little bit over the poverty line, like in some cases it happens with income poverty. Here we're actually looking at how poor they are, not only whether they are poor or not, but how poor they are.
Selina Sonu from Agency Cooperation and Research in Development lamented on how voices can be translated into policies.
And what are the voices saying? If I just take one, for example, from a female participant in Tanzania, when there are cases reported at community level, community leaders converge and take a decision on the matter. Most of the cases are decided in favor of the men, as the committee is principally composed of men. So whenever, even if they bring these cases to the forefront, to the authorities at the local level, they are at a disadvantage because the people who decide on these cases are men. And so right away you see the inequality there. And many others. We heard from Mozambique, we also heard from South Sudan and many other voices coming from that. The second area of analysis was access, ownership, and control over resources. So the complaint from women that we consulted with was they have no access actually to land, which is a means of production for them. They have no access to technology. They have no access to credit. So the things that hinder them from providing livelihoods for their families. Women expressed concerns about exploitation of natural resources at the expense of small-scale or smallholder farmers, especially women. The women in the workshop outlined the fact that it is them more than men who often play the role of conserving and managing the natural resources in which their communities depend on. So, but there they feel, again, you can see the inequality that they do not have access to these things that provide them with the livelihoods that they need.
Winnie Adekunle from the Association of African Women for Research blamed women activists for not paying attention to their own action towards their fellow women.
Then talking of ourselves as women too, within the domestic setting, we have domestic women who are domestic slaves, right within our homes as women. We have people who have so-called housemaid, house helps, and they are like slaves. Women to a woman to a woman. Then we have, I don't know whether many of us we are familiar with this issue of madams, who make young girls sex slaves. We read sometime in Ghana here of a particular case of a woman who brought some girls from Nigeria. A girl talked and promising that they were going to get jobs, and they use them as sex slaves. They take their passport, they do everything, make sure they don't have money. They only have money for feeding. So these girls cannot even travel. This is woman to woman and sex, using another woman as a sex slave.